In the early years of the First Age, Morgoth committed one of the greatest crimes in the entire history of Middle-earth, the creation of orcs, either through the corruption of elves, men, or even animals. Unfortunately, this was far from the only crime committed in regards to orcs. Thousands of years later, Saruman would create his own abominations with fairly insidious implications surrounding their origins. In this video, we talk about half-orcs. Orcs were fairly useful servants for the Dark Lords. They could be mass-produced, they were expendable, they were loyal and reliable so long as they were afraid, and they were cunning in their own ways. However, they also had some major weaknesses. They were much smaller and weaker than most men and elves, and they hated the sunlight and were weakened by it. Even in the late Third Age, we see these limitations. In the Two Towers, the Moria orcs that were accompanying Ugluk's band were slowed down by the sunlight and were the first to be slaughtered by Eomer's riders, and when Sauron launched his invasion of Gondor, he had to send forth dark clouds to block out the sunlight first. Sauron would try to solve this issue, and it would lead him to create a new breed of orcs, the Black Uruks. These orcs were bigger, stronger, and smarter, and in their first appearance from Mordor following the end of the Watchful Peace, they overran Ithilien and Osgiliath before being stopped. The exact logistics behind the creation of Uruks is unknown to us, but it did not remain a secret. For near to the end of the Third Age, Saruman would create Uruks of his own, who called themselves the Uruk-hai, and would actually improve upon them by making them resistant to sunlight. We see this in the aforementioned Two Towers chapter. While the Moria and Mordor orcs are affected by the sunlight, Ugluk and his Uruks are barely bothered. However, Saruman's experiments evidently did not just lead him to Uruks, for he seems to have created something far worse, possibly in his attempts to create Uruks. Half-orcs. Another name that is mentioned is goblin men, but we don't actually know the differences between these two groups or whether they were actually just the same thing. At the very least, it might be that goblin men were more orcish than half-orcs. We see half-orcs appear several times in the story. It's theorized that the squint-eyed southerner in Bree is a half-orc, or at least had orcish blood. Half-orcs are present at the first battle of the Fords of Isen, and one is responsible for killing Theodred. Aragorn mentions seeing them at the Battle of the Hornburg, and some of Saruman's ruffians during the Scouring of the Shire are also half-orcs. In terms of function, half-orcs seem to have been somewhat similar to Saruman's Uruks, possibly because they may have been created through the same means. They could be as tall or strong as a man, and could be intelligent, dangerous fighters. Because of this, they served as some of Saruman's strongest units, being heavily armed and armoured. During the first battle at the Fords, they were deployed to the battlefield specifically to overrun Theodred's position and kill him. They could also be deployed as spies. It was later clear that the Southerner in Bree had orcish blood, but he resembled a regular man enough to be allowed into Bree in the first place. However, not all half-orcs resembled their mannish side. Merry describes the ones who leave Isengard as part of Saruman's army as having goblin faces. Okay, so what makes half-orcs such an abomination? Well, and I'm sorry to make you think about it, it would be the manner in which they were created. Something that you unfortunately must remember about orcs is that they breed just like other races. Male orcs and female orcs get together and create baby orcs. I've done a whole video on this topic in the past, and honestly all I can say is that there's probably little love involved. Given how quickly orcs multiplied in number and how quickly they replenished their losses, in all likelihood, female orcs were probably just used as little more than breeders, basically just cattle. A pretty terrible existence. Except, with half-orcs and goblin men obviously had to be involved. I know what you're thinking, that people were taken prisoner and then essentially used the same way female orcs were. If you can believe it, the truth was actually far worse than that, and we know the truth because Tolkien wrote about this, which can be found in the Myths Transformed section of Morgoth's Ring. It became clear in time that undoubted men could, under the domination of Morgoth or his agents, in a few generations be reduced almost to the orc level of mind and habits, and then they would or could be made to mate with orcs, producing new breeds, often larger and more cunning. There is no doubt that long afterwards, in the Third Age, Saruman rediscovered this, or learned of it in lore, and in his lust for mastery committed this, his wickedest deed, the interbreeding of orcs and men, producing both men-orcs, large and cunning, and orc-men, treacherous and vile. I think this might be one of the most genuinely awful things in Tolkien's universe. This isn't merely a single prisoner being tortured and broken to the point of being reduced to near an orc-like state. This is successive generations of men, raised in darkness, growing up in terrible conditions, where orc-like behaviour is totally normalised, to the point of where they could be made, willing or unwilling, to mate with orcs. It probably gives us an insight into how orcs were created in the first place. Now, Saruman didn't spend that long breeding orcs. He first started in 2990, not even 30 years before the War of the Ring. If he started breaking down men, he could not have started doing so before 2953, when he fortified and isolated himself in Isengard. This is to say that we're not sure if Saruman was able to quite pull off the corrupting successive generations of men thing, because he didn't have that much time. But nonetheless, the end result was the same, and Saruman was able to mix men with orcs, willing or unwilling. He even seems to have been able to create different breeds, the men-orcs and the orc-men, who were probably interchangeable with half-orcs and goblin-men. Speaking of men, that brings us to another dark question. Where did these mannish prisoners come from? Realistically, I think there's only two answers: Rohan or Dunland. If they were from Rohan, they were likely prisoners who were taken in a raid at some point, just another of Saruman's crimes against the Rohirrim. However, I think it's more likely that most, if not all of them, came from Dunland. The reason for this is that they're described as having dark hair, a trait of the Dunlendings, and that the squint-eyed southerner in Bree could clearly pass as a man from Dunland. I don't know, were the Dunlendings just that ugly? It's possible that these Dunlendings were captives from a group that was opposed to Saruman. It's possible that they were Dunlendings who willingly entered Saruman's service and were entrapped, or they were willingly sold off by other Dunlendings. Either way, it reflects extremely poorly on the Dunlendings, because they were willing to ally with Saruman despite these crimes. It's one thing to fight alongside orcs against your enemies, it's even worse to fight alongside orcs who are actually a consequence of some of your fellow people being put through what could only be described as brutal, horrific experiments. Considering Saruman had Dunlendings serving him even before he started breeding orcs, it seems impossible that they didn't know. So at least some of the Dunlendings were not victims of Saruman's lies, they were fully complicit in some of his greatest crimes. And knowing what Saruman was actually doing, it makes him far more sinister than he may come across if you only read the books. Saying only read the books sounds so elitist. What I mean is, you wouldn't know how sinister he is unless you have an unhealthy knowledge of the Legendarium. I think it's easy to relegate Saruman to a lesser evil, a less competent version of Sauron, and that might be true if we look at the sheer volume of crimes and achievements. But when you consider the true horror behind Saruman's breeding of men and orcs, you realize that while Saruman's evil may have been short-lived, it was certainly still extreme. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it or at least found it interesting. I think the information in this video gives us a better idea of some of the things that were going on in the dungeons of places like Isengard, Minas Morgul, and Barad-dûr, and it also reminds us that however bad we think the bad guys were, they were actually somehow worse. Cheers, farewell, and remember, maybe you're one of those people that doesn't need to be broken to mate with orcs. That's good for you. No kink shaming, but I'm definitely kink shaming you.